students? Yeah, still mainly art students. Good. All right. Yeah, so today we're going to hear from Jonathan Nashel, who has an exhibition titled Motorbikes, Motion, Vietnam, which you can tell from the screen, on display in the Foundation Gallery right now. And if you haven't been to the Foundation Gallery, it's basically you walk out this door, you walk into the main entrance of the RITA, and you just take a right and go down the long hallway. And it's right before you cross out to get outside the building. So make sure after the talk you check out his work in person. And also, the best choice would be to meet us from 3 to 5 tonight for a reception of his work, where Jonathan will be there. You can ask him any questions and see the work in person. And yeah, I'm looking forward to Jonathan's talk today, especially because he's not simply another artist coming to you an artist talk. He's also a historian at University of Indiana, or Indiana University, I should say. He's a professor of history. And I'm looking forward to hearing how these two worlds can intersect, because he teaches history courses that range from 20th century American history to the Cold War and American film and photographic history. His book, Lansdale's Cold War, was published in 2005 by the University of Massachusetts Press, and it charted the political and cultural world of an infamous CIA agent. And his recent essays include Meyer, the Gray Man of the CIA, Agents of Influence, the Cultural Power of Espionage, The Bonding of Alan Dulles and James Jesus Angleton, and Adventures in Intelligence History, Stories from the International Spy Museum and Beyond. He's also currently working on a book-length project around the same subjects, similar subjects, Darkness Visible, the Cultural History of the CIA. And now, please welcome Jonathan Nashel.
So first things first, I am not part of the CIA, just to let you guys know that. I studied the CIA, two very different things. I must tell you that when I was in Vietnam, that did not go over well, so, which is a fact. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming here. You're coming to see some of my photos. I'll give some background. Of course, I'm a historian, so I'll give you some background there. But since I'm speaking about Vietnam, should I, instead of saying welcome, should I say greetings, workers, peasants, and fellow revolutionaries. Just about 2 years ago, I was in Vietnam. And I went as something called a Fulbright scholar. And I'm happy to talk more about that a little bit later. But every time I gave a lecture or public presentation at a university, like something like this, I received gifts, plaques, books, medals, you name it. We had to get another suitcase because of all the stuff that I got. I should add that when I went into the school's lecture hall, students routinely stood up and applauded me. And then a staff member would come and bring to me a nice cup of tea. In other words, just like what happened here just now. So I'm very, very, very honored to be here. In that spirit, though, I'd like to acknowledge a couple people who made this all happen. First and foremost, my old dear friend and your current senior vice provost and dean of the faculty and professor of literatures and languages. And I also hear she runs your HVAC system, and she also is in charge of God knows what else, Leslie Walker. You guys, Leslie is the best, or what your parents would have said is the bomb a long time ago. I also really want to thank Colin, the gallery director. We had many conversations, and the first thing, particularly for those of you who are art majors, when you go look at my photos, it takes so much energy to get those photos up on the wall, much more than any of you will have any idea. This is not something where you say, like, it's not like McDonald's where you order French fries and it just comes. It requires a tremendous amount of energy, time, and so I'm very grateful to Colin and to Leslie very much. I should also add, for those of you who might be more business-oriented, to get those French fries to you at McDonald's is actually very complicated too, but that's a different story. But before I chat about my photos, I have a question for all of you. How many of you have a family member or know someone who served during the Vietnam War? Yeah, so that's roughly about half the hands here. So that's very, very interesting to see how the Vietnam War touched so many of us. And I imagine at many campuses that I've been to, there are often war memorials. And if you go to ones, particularly if you go to the old classic Ivy League ones, if you go like right to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, they will often have a statue for all of the college students at that time who served and who paid the ultimate sacrifice and died. And you will see this in all these places. It's astonishing if you go to a place like Harvard or Yale, you will see dozens and dozens and dozens of young men who fought and died and who went to those colleges. And it's very much of a class thing, whereby if you go to a place like Harvard or Yale or Princeton, you will see hundreds of names, and then you will see hardly any who paid the ultimate sacrifice. They did not serve in the same ways, and I could talk about that in my classes. Anyway, my interest in Vietnam has been a decades-long one, and as I've had a fascination with its people, its history, and culture, not to mention its food. And if you've ever had the chance, are there any Vietnamese restaurants around here at all? Or do you have to go to Milwaukee? Anyway, I highly recommend it. And the first thing you'll notice often is that in many of the dishes, they are Asian, but they're different than, say, Chinese food, many, many ways. And one of the classic sandwiches that you can get anywhere in Vietnam, and often in the United States, is something called a banh mi sandwich. And the minute you bite into it, you realize you're not eating classical Asian food, because the food comes on a baguette. And so you're meeting the West and the East because of French colonialism. And it's like one of the reasons to live is to have a good banh mi. It's that good. Anyway, I first became interested in the studies because there's a question that haunted America in the 1960s. And the question was, why did the US go to war in this small Southeast Asian country, of which about 99% of Americans could never have found on a map? As you can imagine, there's a simple answer here. It's called the Cold War and its logics. But it gets very, very complicated the closer and closer you analyze it. I went on to graduate school. I wrote a dissertation, and that later turned into a book about the origins of US involvement in Vietnam. As Colin mentioned, I centered this around this crazy, very infamous CIA officer who seemed to be everywhere, including he got into Oliver Stone's brain, and he felt he was responsible for the killing of President Kennedy. He did not, but go watch JFK if you want to watch an alternate history. And it's quite a story, quite a character. As much as anyone, though, he furthered US involvement into that war. And so what I first want to do, here's Vietnam. As you can see, it's a small Southeast Asian country, very narrow, that hugs the coast, and you can see China. And you will see, for those of you who've had a little bit of Asian history, you will know that the influence of China is quite vast. And you will see, the minute you're in a place like Vietnam, you can see the influence of both China, as it was basically a colony for hundreds and hundreds of years, but you can also see how Vietnam very much created its own absolute unique culture in defiance of China. Here's another map that may put this in a little bit more perspective, that you can see how narrow Vietnam itself is, and you can see how it goes all the way from basically, I would think the tippy-top part is right where Kenosha is, all the way down to the Gulf Coast. But in my Vietnam War classes, I also show this map. And this is something that was put out by the US Armed Forces. And this is all the bombs that were dropped on the countries. And I will return to this in a second. But as you can see, the country of Laos, which is to the west of Vietnam, is still the most bombed country in the world. And they are still dealing with something that is unexploded ordinances. And I'll get more into that. Anyway, the sheer immensity and destruction wrought by the U.S. is something that we still do not fully understand. Just to give you one day in the war, one day and the early part of the war. On September 24th, 1965, the United States flew 167 bombers against the North Vietnamese targets alone, dropping 235 tons of bombs, and simultaneously flew 317 bomber sorties in country. That means South Vietnam. In other words, 270 tons of bombs were dropped in one day. And just very briefly, I'm not going to give a whole history class here, of course, but here's North Vietnam, here's South Vietnam. The United States supported South Vietnam against North Vietnam, which was communist. But complicating matters, for those of you who don't know it, the United States was essentially fighting two wars. It was fighting the war against, they were supporting South Vietnam against North Vietnam, but most American soldiers did not go into North Vietnam whatsoever, just the Air Force. Most American soldiers were in South Vietnam fighting the guerrillas that was came to be known as the Viet Cong. And so most of the fighting took place in the south of the country that we were supporting. All right. This led to my book, and it's very curious because even though he was this all-American guy, he was born in Detroit, he spent some time in Hollywood, he got involved in the advertising agency, and it's funny, this quintessentially American guy, but I've often thought of two English quotes that basically help describe how he operated. And the first is from the very famous British Prime Minister, who was also a novelist, who in one of his novels once said, "The East is a career." He made his mark by going to Asia. And the second quote that I'd like you to keep in mind is by a man that some of you may have heard of named Cecil Rhodes. There's a brand new biography out on Cecil Rhodes, who is the quintessential British imperialist. One of those type of mustaches, and if you've ever looked at a map, the country just north of South Africa is now known as Zimbabwe, but it was known as Rhodesia, named after him. Anyway, this quintessential guy who believed totally in scientific racism and God knows what else, was once asked, what is the secret to making colonialism work? And he said, oh, that's very simple. Make the natives want. Show them things they never knew, and that's how you make it work. Anyway, this is very, very Lansdale. Anyway, so I do all this academic stuff in Vietnam, and my comrade Rebecca, my lovely wife, we're empty nesters now, and I was thinking, what else should we do? And so I decided to apply for a Fulbright to go to Vietnam. I've read all this stuff about it. I've seen every Vietnam War film. I've done all this stuff. And I said, I want to go there. And there was an actual Fulbright where they wanted an American historian to teach American and global history to Vietnamese students. And here's a classic Vietnamese classroom. As you might imagine, they don't have heating systems running around in their classrooms. Though in Hanoi, this is in Hanoi, you do. And it's very interesting. I met so many nice people there. The students were very, very polite. They would always ask me questions about America, such as like, why do we have so many guns? Or why do we do this? And I always had to say, it's complicated. And you know what? That's not a very good answer. But I spent more time saying it's complicated. And let me just tell you one quick question that happened to us. About a week before Rebecca and I came to Vietnam, there was a horrible fire in Hanoi. And they felt that there had not been sufficient fire safety done at the time. And so when I walked into a classroom the very first time, they were doing safety protocols with fire alarms. And they do it differently than they do it here. They threw a smoke bomb into our classroom, and they set off these alarms, and we all ran out. And I said, what the heck is going on here? Because I didn't realize it was just a safety thing, but they scared the hell out of me. I said, I'm going to die in this inferno in the first week. And then the smoke finally cleared, and somehow we survived. Okay, great. Here we survived. I should add that the woman on the left, you can see front, she did an advanced degree her husband did an advanced degree at the university, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And they loved Johns Hopkins so much that their son was born there, and they gave his middle name Johns. And then they had a daughter, and so I said, so did you give her middle name Hopkins? And she looked at me like I had two heads in my head, like I thought it was, but she said, no, we did not give our child Hopkins. But they gave John, so there you go. Anyway, one of the things I did, even though I went there to teach, is I fell into a research project, which I'll tell you more about. In some ways, it involves this. We went to lots and lots of museums. And often we would be the only people walking around these museums. And this is the type of image you would see often about how the Vietnam War was fought. And the first thing you need to know is the Vietnamese don't refer to it as the Vietnam War, they call it the American War. Because they had been fighting the French and the Chinese, and then they fought at other times. They got involved with China. There was a war with China and the Japanese, and so they call us the American War. And in this classic image that you would see in many, many types of museums, you see three young women. These are all Viet Cong guerrillas. And they both have their AK-47s, and they're reading some poetry from a very famous Vietnamese classical scholar from, I think, something like the 14th or 15th century. But we'd be wandering around these museums, but this is what we saw much more frequently. We saw Instagram postings. We saw, and I was very, very struck that people were not looking at the museum stuff as much, but they were doing this. Or, here's some high-end, obviously meant chocolate that is designed for basically tourists. And this is 1960s shtick. The war itself sells, and so they sell it. It's an object. And in the middle, you can see two Viet Cong guerrillas firing ground-to-air things, shooting down American F-4 planes, of which you can buy a piece of chocolate. It seems odd, doesn't it? But what I found much odder in my travels of Vietnam was I saw things like this that I could not believe. This is a high-end coffee shop, Viet Cong coffee shop, of which you can go in there and get insanely good coffee. The Vietnamese take coffee as seriously as any place in the world. You want a cup of coffee that could wake up the dead, you go to Vietnam. They also like it sweeter than I do, but that's my taste. But this is a Viet Cong sticky place of which you can buy 1960s artifacts in the place. But if you look, there aren't that many tourists. The Vietnamese, basically young people like you, like to go to places like this. I now want to show you, though, another photo I took. And this is in downtown Hanoi. And this is basically the equivalent of, I'm not sure, the equivalent of basically the Magnificent Mile, even though it's very different than Chicago. And I want you to see a couple things here. First of all, there's my comrade, there's Rebecca. If you look closely, there's a Vietnamese guy because he has two heads, and very unusual that he's got two heads there. But you can see, do you see the Gucci in the Burberry? But then in the left-hand side, you see a classic image of the man who led the communist revolution, Ho Chi Minh, who spent his life traveling around the world. He discovers Marxism as a way to explain why the French are ruling over the Vietnamese, but more importantly, he was given the tools of how to defeat the French and create essentially a socialist state in Vietnam. And if you look closely enough, you can see Ho Chi Minh there. You can see he's holding a child. This is a classic image that you saw all throughout Vietnam, the actual image. And you can see it's superimposed upon Picasso's Dove of Peace. My feeling is late-stage capitalism is alive and well in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And I could not believe that I would see, it is more capitalist in many ways than you would see almost any place else. But the things that you're going to see off in the gallery later, and this is one of the images, this was basically our first day. And I remember turning to Rebecca and I said, how are we going to cross a street here in Vietnam? I didn't think it was possible. But the first thing I learned is the Vietnamese, I grew up in New Jersey, you guys. And the first thing I learned was, unlike New Jersey, they're not aiming to hit you. So it's they're very, and everyone drives at the same speed, and they are unbelievably good drivers of motorbikes. That is how the entire town just operates on motorbikes. But we were not really on motorbikes. We were told by Fulbright that we should really not be on the passenger seat of a motorbike, and because we're old and whatnot. So we often took the equivalent of an Uber, which is called Grab. And these cars, we would get into the Grab, and I would chat with the guy using Google Translate. And I invariably, when we're trying to cross a street like this is what I would say to them over and over and over. I don't know if any of you speak any Vietnamese, but like every time I said this, the guy would always go like this. He would always just say, I have to be a very good driver. But so that was really one of my very first photos. But if you look closely, you can see the Vietnamese flag, but you can also see the financial institutions that are all throughout Vietnam. The banking system is very, very vibrant in Vietnam. But what's also very vibrant, and I'm going to show you guys a couple slides, is you would see entire families on the motorbikes. And you could see the mom is in the back, and women would often wear these, I guess, coveralls that you would see. And that is, of course, to protect their clothing, but also because picking up from the gravel and whatnot, that would happen. And the kids would just be right in the middle. What you can also see is she's looking at her phone while the husband is driving. You could see the husband and wife have helmets. You get fined very heavily if you don't have a helmet. I think kids, for some bizarre reason, are not fined if you don't have a helmet. You think kids should have the helmets, and this is, I'm sorry to get a little dark here, but one of the fellow Fulbrighters that I met was this psychologist, and he taught at some school in Texas. And this guy is trained as a psychologist, but he does very scientific stuff. And he can read CAT scans. And one of the things he could do is, because Vietnam has an unusually high amount of brain injuries because of that. And they learn how to operate very much on the brain. And he described over a couple beers how you operate on the brain, and oh my God, how to just remove the skull, and you fix the swelling, and you put it back on, and they're very, very good at it. And anyway, please wear your helmets, you guys, okay? Just wear your helmets. So now I want to show you a couple photos. And the first thing I should tell you is that I love photography. It's always been my longtime hobby. And I have nice cameras. I have a couple really nice cameras. But I learned really quickly that if I'm going to communicate or travel or walk, I always needed my phone out. And so almost all of the photos that you'll see were all shot with an iPhone 12. And so the first thing I want to tell, particularly to the art major, is, you know the old joke, what's the best camera? Is the one you got in your hand. And so while, sure, it's really nice to have a Leica or a Hasselblad or a medium format camera, just take photos. Just take photos, and then finally learn to edit. Every day, what I did every single day is I would shoot 40 pictures, and I saved 2 of them. And of course, there's a little bit of a danger there, because sometimes the stuff you don't think is good later on. But I began to know, I became very interested in the motorbikes, in the motorcycles, and I said, this is what I wanted to do, and so I followed this. And this is another one of those images where just shooting with an iPhone 12, and you get a sense of the speed that's involved. I should let you know, I've heard, is the busiest street around here Green Bay? Is that the busiest street around the Green Bay? Is that the busiest street? If you saw a little old lady walking across Green Bay Avenue, is it? Road. If you saw a little old lady who is this tall, walking with 2 dogs and carrying something, would you not find that unusual? But the first thing Rebecca and I learned was, that's the person we follow. And what they say is that we would literally get right next to her because you walk straight, you don't stop, you never back up. And it worked. I'm here. But this is the type of road you had to pass. And it is a shock. And often many of these photographs, though, were shot from the grab. And here, of course, for those of you who know photography, all you have to do is scan, and that's how you can get both the motion and the stillness at the same time. And as you can see, the city runs in ways that are just astonishing on the motorbikes. And what this guy has is he's recycling all this material. And so the city is in constant, it's also a noise, and they all have the same beep, beep noise. And they honk their horns. In other words, it's, again, not like New Jersey, where it's basically a huge FU. This is just, hi, I'm here, just don't hit me. That's how they would always click it. And what I became very interested in over a short period of time was just how everything was the same but wildly different every single time I walked outside of our apartment. And I would just see this all the time. And I began to shoot dozens and dozens and dozens of these photos. And there's a whole lot of them, just this gallery right around here. But I have 100 or so more, and you can go to my website, jonathannashel.com, and you can look at a lot more of them that I've curated. And I just became interested in the shapes and the sizes, and these are all taken with an iPhone 12. And so I get stuff like this. I mean, can you imagine this driving around Kenosha? Would a cop not stop this person immediately? And there's the HVAC that your vice provost is installing somewhere here. But I look at these images, which I took 2 years ago, and I feel like, oh my goodness. Here is an image right outside our apartment, and this woman would just drive around our lake, just selling little wares, like if you wanted to buy small staples, everything from tissues to a pen to if you wanted a cup of coffee. And there's Rebecca waiting for our Grab driver to arrive. Here's a photo I took outside of our supermarket that we would go to. And you could see a very stylish young woman and her child. You can tell she's a little bit wealthier because she's not driving the classic Honda, she's driving a Vespa. And the daughter is beyond adorable. One of the things that I was very struck by is, do you remember, you guys were all alive during COVID. You remember the politics involved with masks here in the United States. And it's not a case at all in Asia and particularly in Vietnam. People still wear masks all the time, and part of it has to do with dust and pollution. But you could see how it was just a thing. It did not enter the political realm the way that if anything, it's considered being basically courteous in some ways. But I just remember this photo of this woman is going to try to inch out into that traffic, of which requires tremendous skill. Here we are right outside what used to be a huge U.S. Air Force base, Da Nang. There was a 1980s TV show called China Beach. If any of you remember that TV show, this is basically like 100 yards from where American aircraft were taking off and bombing large sections of Southeast Asia. But here you can see it's kind of tropical, and their goal is to basically turn this into Hawaii. And as you might imagine, there's tremendous overdevelopment. They have built way too many of these hotels right very close to the beach, and they get flooding problems. And I must tell you, the floods in Vietnam are quite spectacular. One of the things I noticed over and over was also, if you look at her baseball cap, I don't know if you can make it out, but I did not see a single Milwaukee Brewers cap. But boy, I sure saw the New York Yankees and LA Dodgers. I even saw a few old Chicago Bulls 23. You cannot believe how the New York Yankees have essentially colonized the entire world. And even though I grew up a Mets fan, at one point in your life, you should probably go to Yankee Stadium. It's a little different than the Brewers Stadium, which is really nice. I got to tell you something. Brewer Stadium is really, what's the name of it? Family Field. It's great, okay? And I like the Brewers more than the Cubs, but I'm a Mets fan most of all. Anyway, as I began spending more and more time doing this, I became a little bit more particular in some of the photos that I was using. And so here are two women, and these two women are flight attendants on Vietnam Airlines. And we flew all over, and I have to tell you, you spend one flight on Vietnam Airlines, and your first thought was, United and Delta, could you please see what they're doing? Because it just runs so nicely and very nice. They are, though, I'm sure they are much stricter in who can become a flight attendant and things of this sort, but it is astonishing. And also, to give you an idea of colonization, as I understand it, the Vietnamese pilots who are making a flight within Vietnam are speaking to air traffic control in English. The whole entire air traffic control system runs in English around the world. You would just see just tremendous colors and vibrancy. When I saw this, I turned to Rebecca. I said that motorbike might float off like Mary Poppins might float up, but it didn't. Here's a young couple. And there's a guy snoozing. My hunch is most of us could not do that very well. Last summer, I went back to Vietnam. I was invited to Vietnam to go back and give some more lectures one place. And while there, we had met friends. We went to the country next to Vietnam, which is Cambodia. And if you want to go into the dark side of humanity, you go to Cambodia. And the country is basically now just rebuilding from the devastation that occurred in the 1970s. My goal here is not to completely depress you, but they think close to a third, maybe a quarter of the population was killed within a 4-year period of time because of basically this fanatical Pol Pot communist regime. But the country is slowly coming back, and that's where I shot this photo. One of the photos, and if you go to Cambodia, the country right next to Vietnam, you can tell immediately how different it is from Vietnam because you see much less of the influence of China and much more of the influence of India. And so you see the cuisine is different, and you see much more of India's old, ancient, and you go to Angkor Wat, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and everyone goes there for daybreak so they can have something approaching an epiphany. And we saw a lot of, you have to be very careful when you go there because they have these monkeys in the trees that have got into the habit of coming down, jumping, and taking tourist cell phones and then taking them up to the top of the trees and then not giving them back. So got to be careful. Hold on to your cell phone very carefully if you go to Angkor Wat. Okay, so I'm a historian. My specialty is the Cold War. I study the Vietnam War, and in some ways, this is the most political photo that I took. This is right outside our hotel, our apartment. And as you can see, it's 3 young guys, and of course, they're passing what, you guys? A BMW dealership. The name of this street is Le Duan. Now, I'm not asking you to know that much, but basically, the guy who replaced Ho Chi Minh was Le Duan. There he is, toasting Mao Zedong. Le Duan was the most hardened and tough revolutionary you can imagine. This guy, unlike Ho Chi Minh was tough, this guy was really tough. And he got to know really well French, what it was like to be in the French penal colonies. And he read in French prison colonies, he read Molière, a very famous French playwright. But the idea, and this guy died in '86, he took over. The idea that on his avenue, there is a BMW dealership is mind-bending. The closest analogy I can think of is if at some point, if they have a Donald Trump Avenue someplace in Kenosha, and on it is a Planned Parenthood, an LGBT center, a crunchy granola co-op, and everyone has to wear Birkenstocks. I mean, like, this place is the idea that there is you spend 5 minutes studying Lansdale, and he is turning in his grave right now. In the same way that Ho Chi Minh did not have this revolution so that Gucci and Burberry would be free to trade, Lansdale was that times 10, very, very much so. Anyway, this has all led to my next project. And I thought I would just tell you a little bit about my project and some ideas, and I'm hoping to go back to Vietnam. And I want to tell you, though, that when you look at my images, I want you to see, in so many ways, though, before I talk about it, how so many of the people have moved on from the war and the devastation of the war. The 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, their parents experienced it, but they themselves did not. And what their parents have experienced is they have gone from tremendous deprivation to basically beginning to approach what we would think of as middle class. And it is astonishing how the GDP of Vietnam is something like 8% a year. And our country, of course, would burst at the seams if that happened. They are growing dramatically. And, of course, this is increasing wealth, but it's also causing tremendous side effects, of which one of them is pollution. And they have Hanoi, which is in the north, is one of the most polluted cities in the world. I did not really realize what it was like to live with such air pollution, but you can get meters. You do not need to be told it's air pollution. You can feel it. Our son came out to visit us, and he's he runs. He tried to run. He said he could not run. But one of the things that the government is doing is they have now implemented what is going on in China. And they've now banned all gas-powered motorbikes and cars in basically the equivalent of downtown Hanoi. And then they're going to expand to the next ring, and then the next ring. And they can do this type of stuff much easier than we can, because in America, we would have endless lawsuits over this type of stuff. The communists said, this is what we're going to do, and what I must tell you is that we happened to visit our son in Beijing last year, and the air at one point was cleaner than it was in Indiana, where I live now. So it can be done with electric things, but you know as well as I do that everything is very political in the United States. And the communists said, we can't have this air pollution, and this goes on. They have failed in other things, but we can get on to that. Anyway, my time has led to this Fulbright, to this research project. And I'm basically doing two things here. And one is how the Vietnamese communists in their museums manage history, how they make certain things disappear. And I see that happening in our country, and it happens in all countries. History is a live wire. It is a weapon to be used by people. And I'm reminded when I do this, whereby there's an eerie quality of watching history appear and disappear. If you've been following the news, just this week, the Trump administration removed outside of Philadelphia history next to where George Washington worked as our first president, the fact that he brought slaves with him there. And they had just had empty slots where that is. They just basically, they whitewashed it. They made it disappear. Federal judges now said that it should be allowed back in, and so we're having these endless battles. I can assure you that we are about to celebrate our 250th anniversary, and I understand there will be UFC fighting on the White House lawn. There will be Formula One drag races in D.C., and there's going to be endless fighting about what does it mean to be an American. And really, I'm asking all of you, make sure you follow the news. Don't read it obsessively, but follow the news, because you need to be aware of what is going on. Because I saw what was going on in Vietnam, how they make a lot of that history just disappear. And basically, it's an unmooring of a society. in the same way that any house is only as good as its structure, its sub-basement and its basement. When you begin to manipulate and take things out, you weaken the entire structure of the place. Now, this is not unusual. This happens all over the place. As the historian Simon Willmetts has remarked, nations have long used history as a genealogy of a nation's wonderfulness. But with that in mind, I'm following in the footsteps of the great 19th century Ernest Renan, who once said, "The historian is the enemy of the nation." So anyway, it's a bummer of a project, but hey, you know, that's why we all take history classes, right? That's what we should do. So I could talk more about that. But my photography is going to meld very much with this history in this next project I'm doing, of which I want to refer to it as After the Americans. What happened after the United States left Southeast Asia in 1975? So let's just go back to this picture I showed you. And one of the things that we did was, this is 2 years ago, we went to the U.S.-Vietnam Friendship Festival in this very famous place in downtown Hanoi, right across from where the mausoleum of Ho Chi Minh is buried. And it was basically the U.S. and Vietnam, basically a day of how wonderful our countries are. I gathered there was a huge fight because the U.S. State Department at the time brought this woman who is a hip-hop artist, and the Vietnamese weren't quite sure if her lyrics would be appropriate. So they actually, diplomats were going over her lyrics of sometimes. Kind of familiar with that program Genius, Lyric Genius, to see, like, is she saying stuff that's inappropriate? But they finally said it's okay. Once you get inside this place, the Citadel, you saw a thriving American Vietnamese middle class. Now, never in my mind, if you could have a banh mi sandwich or a soggy hamburger, you're going to choose the banh mi sandwich. But the Vietnamese just love the hamburgers because it's different. They all went there. Travel and study in the U.S. Things have changed very much in the last year, but the Vietnamese all basically wanted their kids to go to American universities. And then I saw this image. Is there anything more quintessential than the yellow school bus? And there's an old Bob Dylan song called "I Threw It All Away." And there you are right now. Look at that. These Vietnamese, the children, obviously, the parents experienced as children probably the end of the Vietnam War. Their parents really experienced. In other words, these kids' grandparents know what American power is all about. And here they are posing in front of a school bus. About 100 yards in the center of this place, once you get past the soggy hamburgers and the brochures to go to places like University of Wisconsin Parkside, is the center of the Citadel, built something like 900 years ago between the Chinese and the Vietnamese. And if you walk down to the basement, you go into what's equivalent of the war room that the Vietnamese communists plotted the battles against the United States. And if you go deeper into it, here's a map showing the B-52 bomber. They knew exactly what time the B-52 bombers would fly from Guam and places like that, and Thailand. And for those of you who don't know, that is what a B-52 bomber looks like. And on the bottom right, that is their motto, and their motto is "Death from Above." As a historian, this is the type of documentation that I come across as about the Vietnam War. And yet there they are, little kids, wanting to pose with the school bus. This is what I want to photograph. We would go to places that would show you what a B-52 bomber crater is. Trust me, this is a much more accurate one. And then, unbelievably, very close to that Citadel, there was the Vietnam War Museum, which is moved, and there is a B-52 bomber that was shot down by a Soviet ground-air missile and a very unusual garbage can shaped like a penguin. And then later that day, we were in we went to a restaurant, and this is the type of thing I'm working on, trying to figure out. Here's a cocktail thing, and the third one down, you can order yourself a B-52 cocktail. In Hoi An, you can buy a B-52 t-shirt. In Laos, when we visited there, this is all the areas of one little tiny district in red of places where they still have to deal with unexploded ordinances. This is interesting, but Obama, as president, visited there. And he took a huge, keen interest in after the Americans, what we left behind, how we can help them. And one of the things they have found out, and this sounds crazy, but it is true, they found this rat. There's this very special type of rat that they can train to sniff out unexploded bombs. And you can go to these places and they train them and they go into these areas and they clean out to do this stuff. It will take 150 years to do that all. But where do you see right across the street from there? Well, there's America. Or, I happened to notice this ad on the Super Bowl just last week. You can't get more American than this. But you go into a supermarket after the Americans, you will not see these Lay's potato chips here in the United States. And I don't know if I have time, but the very first meal that Rebecca and I went to is we went to this meal that President Obama went to in this little small shop. There he is with Anthony Bourdain. There we were in a university that they called the American Hangout. One of the tragedies to befall American-Vietnam relations is that there's this thing that is very, very sophisticated, of which we are now able to find and identify people who died during the war. And we have roughly, we have about 6,000 MIAs still left in Vietnam. The Vietnamese have roughly 1 million. And we were working with the Vietnamese to basically bring the families of the fallen soldier to their families. And this has unfortunately come to an end. This was the type of policy that the U.S. was doing. In the museums I walked to, it always ended though. America never left Southeast Asia. We are everywhere. Okay, so I don't know if I have time, but I could show the video, or I could do Q&A, or how do you want to do this? Okay, Q&A. You guys, thank you very much. Thank you. Anyway, I hope you like my photos. Go to my website. You'll see hundreds more. And any questions? Any worries? Concerns? Help you? Yes? Is it any good? What's the name of it? All right, all right, all right. Saigon Panda? That's mixing Vietnamese and Chinese there, but...
They're mainly Vietnamese, they mix a little bit of Chinese, and very recently, like this past week, if anyone knows, the Sushi restaurant has now moved into there as well, so they also have Japanese. But at its core, it's a Vietnamese restaurant.
All right, so now you learn